Imagine a man who spent 16 years of his life collecting the material for a single book. Imagine a scholar so careful, so exacting, so devoted to accuracy, that out of hundreds of thousands of reports he had gathered and memorized, he chose only a few thousand for his great work, rejecting the vast majority as not meeting his rigorous standards. Imagine a mind of such extraordinary memory that, by the accounts, he could hear a long and complex report once and retain it perfectly, that he carried within him the knowledge of hundreds of thousands of traditions, each with its chain of transmitters reaching back across the generations. Imagine a boy who lost his father in infancy, who was raised by a devoted mother, who, it is said, recovered his eyesight in childhood through her prayers after he had gone blind. Imagine a young man who, before he was 20, had already begun the great work of his life, who would spend some 40 years traveling across the whole of the known Muslim world, from Central Asia to Arabia, from Iraq to Egypt, gathering the traditions of his faith from thousands of teachers, verifying each one with painstaking care. Imagine a scholar so devoted to accuracy that he would travel for days to verify a single report, and so principled that, by the accounts, he abandoned a journey to learn from a man whom he had seen deceive an animal, judging that one who would deceive a beast could not be trusted to transmit the truth. This is the story of such a man. His name was Muhammad, and he is remembered by the world as Imam Bukhari, after the city of Bukhara where he was born. He lived more than 1100 years ago, in the 9th century, in the lands of Central Asia and the wider Muslim world, in an age of great learning. He was a scholar of hadith, the recorded traditions of what the prophet of his faith had said and done, and he became the greatest of all the collectors and verifiers of these traditions. And the book he produced, after 16 years of labor and a lifetime of travel and study, came to be regarded, in his tradition, as the most authentic book after the sacred scripture itself. We will follow his whole life tonight, slowly and gently, from his birth in the city of Bukhara to his remarkable childhood, his early devotion to the traditions, his decades of travel across the Muslim world in search of knowledge, the rigorous method by which he verified the traditions he gathered, the great work he produced, and the close of his devoted life. It is a story about devotion to truth, about the painstaking labor of preserving knowledge with perfect accuracy, about a life given wholly to the gathering and verifying and preserving of the precious traditions of a faith. And through it all runs a quiet question, gentle and enduring. What does it mean to devote a life to truth, to the patient and exacting labor of preserving what is precious with perfect care? So settle in, and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old story carry you gently towards sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 1100 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some quiet moment of your own, the pull of the thing that drove this man's whole life, the devotion to getting something exactly right, the care for accuracy and truth, the unwillingness to accept the false or the doubtful when the true could be found. We live in an age awash with information of every kind, much of it unreliable, and we know something of the difficulty of sorting the true from the false, the reliable from the doubtful. Imam Bukhari devoted his entire life to exactly this labor, on the grandest scale, sorting the authentic traditions from the unreliable with a care and a rigor that have rarely been matched. There is a quiet inspiration, as the night settles, in keeping company with a man so devoted to truth, so careful to preserve only what was genuine. So as we begin the long walk back through his life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and true story unfold at its own unhurried pace, the way the night itself unfolds, slowly and gently, toward the quiet of deep sleep. We will move softly, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the man, we must first understand the world that made him, and the particular kind of knowledge to which he devoted his life. We must travel back to the 9th century, to the lands of the Muslim world, in what has been called its golden age, an age of great learning and scholarship. And we must understand the science to which Imam Bukhari gave his life, the science of hadith, of the traditions of the Prophet, for it was one of the central and most important sciences of his faith, and his contribution to it was his great achievement. The traditions of the Prophet were, and are, among the most precious treasures of his faith. After the sacred scripture itself, they were the most important source of guidance, the record of what the Prophet had said and done, preserved and transmitted across the generations. For the believers, these traditions were a guide to how their faith should be lived, a source of law and practice and wisdom, second in authority only to the scripture itself. To preserve these traditions accurately, to know truly what the Prophet had said and done, was therefore a matter of the greatest importance, central to the right practice of the faith. But there was a great difficulty in this, a difficulty that grew more pressing as time passed. For the traditions had been transmitted orally, passed down from one person to another across the generations, from those who had known the Prophet to their students, and from them to the next generation, and so on down the years. And as they were transmitted, across many generations in many lands, errors could creep in, reports could be confused or altered, and, worse, false traditions could be invented and attributed to the Prophet, whether through honest error or deliberate fabrication. By the 9th century, when Imam Bukhari lived, vast numbers of traditions were in circulation, of wildly varying reliability. The genuine mingled with the mistaken and the fabricated. The great difficulty was to sort the authentic from the unreliable, to preserve the genuine traditions and to set aside the false. This was the great task to which Imam Bukhari devoted his life. The sorting of the authentic traditions from the unreliable, the preservation of the genuine and the rejection of the false. It was a task of immense importance, for the integrity of the faith's guidance depended upon it. And a task of immense difficulty, requiring vast knowledge, painstaking labor, and rigorous judgment. A whole science had developed around this task, the science of hadith, with sophisticated methods for evaluating the reliability of traditions, examining their chains of transmitters, judging the trustworthiness of those who had passed them down. And Imam Bukhari would become the greatest master of this science, the most rigorous and exacting of all the collectors and verifiers of the traditions. This, then, was the world into which he came, and the task to which he would devote his life. A golden age of learning, in which the precious traditions of the faith had multiplied and mingled with error and fabrication, and in which the great task was to sort the authentic from the unreliable, to preserve the genuine and reject the false. Into this world a child was born in the city of Bukhara, who would become the greatest of all the verifiers of the traditions, and would produce, after a lifetime of labor, the book that would be regarded as the most authentic collection of all. Let us linger a while longer in the world of Imam Bukhari's age, for it was a remarkable time, and understanding it helps us to see why his life's work was so necessary and so valued. The 9th century, in which he lived, fell within what has been called the golden age of his civilization, an age of great learning and cultural flourishing across the vast lands of the Muslim world. This was an age in which learning was prized and supported, in which scholars were honored, in which the sciences flourished. Great cities had become centers of scholarship, gathering libraries and scholars and students, supporting the pursuit of knowledge in many fields. The inheritance of earlier civilizations had been gathered and translated and studied, and new knowledge was being created across many sciences. It was a cosmopolitan age of learning, connected across vast distances by trade and travel and a common scholarly culture, in which knowledge flowed across the wide expanse of the Muslim world. Within this broad flourishing of learning, the science of the traditions held a special place, for it concerned the preservation of the most precious knowledge of the faith, the record of what the Prophet had said and done. This was not merely an academic matter but a sacred trust, for upon the accurate preservation of the traditions depended the right understanding and practice of the faith. The traditions guided the believers in how to live, how to worship, how to order their lives and their communities. To preserve them accurately, to know truly what the Prophet had taught, was therefore a matter of the greatest religious importance, central to the integrity of the faith itself, and the need for this preservation had grown urgent by Bukhari's age, for reasons we have touched upon. The traditions had been transmitted orally across generations, and as time passed, as the distance from the Prophet's age grew, the dangers to their accurate preservation multiplied. Memories could fail, reports could be confused, and, most dangerously, false traditions could be invented and attributed to the Prophet. By the 9th century, vast numbers of traditions were in circulation, of widely varying reliability. The genuine mingled with the mistaken and the fabricated. The need to sort the authentic from the false had become pressing, for the integrity of the faith's guidance depended upon it. This was why the science of the traditions had developed, with its sophisticated methods for evaluating reliability, and why the work of scholars like Bukhari was so valued. They were the guardians of the faith's precious knowledge, the ones who labored to preserve the genuine traditions and to expose the false, ensuring that what was passed on to future generations was reliable and true. Their work was a service of the greatest importance, a guarding of the faith's integrity, a preservation of its precious inheritance. And Bukhari became the greatest of these guardians, the most rigorous and exacting of all, whose work would be trusted above all others. We can understand, then, why Bukhari's life's work was so necessary and so valued. He lived in an age when the accurate preservation of the traditions had become urgent, when the genuine had to be sorted from the false to protect the integrity of the faith, and he devoted his life to exactly this task, with a rigor and a care that surpassed all others, producing a collection whose reliability could be trusted with the greatest confidence. His work met a pressing need of his age, the need for the accurate preservation of the faith's precious knowledge, and it met it more fully than any other, which is why it came to be so revered. Something speaks to our own age in this, for we too live in a time when the accurate preservation and transmission of knowledge has become urgent, when the false mingles so easily with the true, when the sorting of the reliable from the unreliable is a pressing need. Our age is awash with information of every kind, much of it unreliable, fabricated, or misleading, and the difficulty of distinguishing the true from the false has become one of our great challenges. Bukhari's age faced a version of this challenge in the realm of the traditions, and his response, the rigorous sorting of the authentic from the false, the careful verification of what was reliable, speaks to our own need for such rigor and care in our handling of information. His example, though from a distant age and a different realm, points to a discipline that our own age urgently needs. So let us leave the wide world behind now, and turn toward the city of Bukhara, where a child was born who would devote his life to the preservation of truth. The city was Bukhara, in the lands of Central Asia that are now part of Uzbekistan, a great city on the trade routes that connected East and West, a center of commerce and learning in the wider Muslim world. And it was here, in the year 810, that the child who would become Imam Bukhari was born, and given the name Muhammad. His full name carried, as was the custom, the names of his ancestors, and it is said that his great-grandfather had been the first of the family to embrace the faith, having come to it from the older religion of those lands. His father was a scholar of some learning, a man who had himself studied the traditions of the Prophet, who had learned from respected teachers, and who had a love of knowledge. But the father would not live to guide his gifted son, for he died when Bukhari was still very young, an infant or a small child. The boy was left fatherless, to be raised by his mother, a devout and devoted woman who would care for him and nurture his gifts in the absence of his father. We should pause to honor this mother, less remembered than the famous son she raised, but without whose devoted care there might have been no Imam Bukhari at all. It was she who raised the fatherless boy, who saw to his upbringing and his early education, who supported his developing love of knowledge. There is a story told of his childhood, one of the most beloved in the accounts of his life, which we should tell gently, as a treasured tradition, rather than insisting on its every detail. It is said that as a young child, Bukhari lost his eyesight, becoming blind, and that his mother was deeply grieved by this affliction. She prayed earnestly for her son, by the accounts, beseeching God to restore his sight. And it is said that her prayers were answered, that the boy's eyesight was restored to him, and that this was understood as a sign of God's favor upon him. We tell such a story gently, as a beloved tradition treasured by those who loved him, without insisting on its every detail. But it points to something the accounts agree upon, that here was a child marked from his earliest years by something special, raised by a devoted mother, whose prayers and care surrounded him. What is beyond dispute is that the young Bukhari possessed, from his earliest years, an extraordinary memory, a gift that would be the foundation of his entire life's work. His memory was prodigious, far beyond the ordinary, able to retain vast quantities of material with perfect accuracy. In an age when the traditions were preserved largely through memory, when a scholar's mind was his library, such a memory was a gift of immense value, and Bukhari's was among the most remarkable ever recorded. He could hear a tradition once and retain it perfectly. He could hold in his mind hundreds of thousands of traditions, each with its chain of transmitters. He could recall, instantly and accurately, the precise wording of reports he had gathered. This extraordinary memory was the foundation upon which his life's work would be built. Let us dwell more deeply on the extraordinary memory of Imam Bukhari, for it was the foundation of his entire life's work, and it is one of the most remarkable things about him. For in an age when the traditions were preserved largely through memory, when a scholar's mind was his library, the power of memory was the essential gift of the scholar, and Bukhari's memory was among the most powerful ever recorded. Consider what his work required of his memory. He gathered over his decades of travel hundreds of thousands of traditions, each one consisting not only of the report itself, the saying or action of the Prophet, but of its chain of transmission, the line of narrators through whom it had come down. To hold all this in memory, the vast number of reports, each with its chain of narrators, accurately and reliably, required a memory of truly extraordinary power. And Bukhari possessed exactly this, a memory that could hold hundreds of thousands of traditions with their chains, that could recall any of them instantly and accurately, that could retain a complex report after hearing it only once. There are many stories told of his prodigious memory, which we should hold gently as the traditions that gathered around so famous a figure, but which capture something real about his extraordinary gift. It is said that he could hear a long list of traditions once and repeat them all back perfectly. It is said that scholars would test him by deliberately altering the chains of transmission, mixing up the narrators, and that Bukhari would immediately detect the errors and correct them, restoring each tradition to its proper chain. It is said that his memory was so reliable that he could be trusted absolutely on the precise wording of the traditions and the exact composition of their chains. Whatever the precise truth of each story, they reflect a memory of genuinely extraordinary power, one of the great memories in the history of learning. This extraordinary memory was, as we have said, the foundation of his life's work, for for without it he could not have accomplished what he did. The gathering of hundreds of thousands of traditions, the holding of them all in mind with their chains, the comparison of different versions, the detection of flaws and inconsistencies, all of this depended on his prodigious memory. His memory was his library, his database, his working tool, the place where the vast material of his work was held and processed. The achievements of his life flowed, in large part, from this extraordinary gift of memory, this capacity to hold and recall vast quantities of precise information. But we should not imagine that his memory alone accounts for his achievements, for memory without judgment would not have sufficed. Many people have good memories. Few accomplish what Bukhari accomplished. What set him apart was the combination of his prodigious memory with an extraordinary critical judgment, a penetrating ability to evaluate the reliability of the traditions he held. His memory gave him the vast material. His judgment allowed him to sort it, to distinguish the authentic from the unreliable, to detect the subtle flaws that rendered a tradition doubtful. It was the combination of the memory and the judgment, the vast store of material and the rigorous critical faculty, that made him the greatest of the verifiers of the traditions. Consider the role of memory in learning, which our own age has perhaps undervalued. In an age when information is so easily accessible, stored outside ourselves in books and devices, we may rely less on memory, may even disparage it as a mere mechanical faculty, inferior to understanding or creativity. But Bukhari's example reminds us of the power and the value of a well-stocked memory, of the knowledge held within ourselves, ready for use. For the knowledge we carry within us in our memory is available to us in a way that external information is not, ready to be connected, compared, brought to bear on the questions we face. Bukhari's prodigious memory, holding the vast material of his work, allowed him to do things that no external store of information could have enabled, to make the connections and comparisons and judgments that his work required. And we might reflect, too, on the way his memory was joined to devotion, on the fact that he filled his extraordinary memory, not with trivial things, but with the precious traditions of his faith, the knowledge he held most sacred. A great memory could be filled with anything, with trivia or with treasure. Bukhari filled his with the traditions of his faith, devoting his prodigious gift to the preservation of what he held most precious. His memory served his devotion, the extraordinary gift placed in the service of the sacred task of preserving the faith's precious knowledge. And there is something fitting in this, the great gift devoted to the great task, the prodigious memory filled with the precious traditions, the extraordinary capacity placed in the service of the accurate preservation of truth. He turned early to the study of the traditions, beginning, by the accounts, when he was only about 10 or 11 years old, and he advanced with astonishing speed, his prodigious memory allowing him to absorb the traditions and their chains of transmission far faster than ordinary students. There is a famous story, which captures both his gifts and his character, of how, even as a boy, he could correct the errors of older students and teachers. It is said that he would attend the gatherings of the scholars, listening to the traditions being recited, and that he noticed errors in the chains of transmission that even the teachers had missed, and corrected them, to the astonishment of those present. The boy had a command of the traditions and their chains that surpassed even his elders. A particular story, told of his boyhood, captures this precocity. It is said that when he was a young boy attending the gatherings of the scholars, an older student asked him, perhaps teasingly, how many traditions he had written down. The shy young boy answered modestly, naming a small number. The audience laughed at the small answer. But one of the perceptive teachers present, recognizing the extraordinary gifts of the boy, remarked that one day this child would surpass them all. And so it would prove, for the shy boy with the prodigious memory would indeed surpass all the scholars of his age, becoming the greatest of all the collectors and verifiers of the traditions. By his middle teens, The young Bukhari had already mastered the traditions available in his own region, had gathered all that the scholars of his homeland could teach him, and had even begun to compose his own works. It is said that he had memorized the books of the leading scholars of his age, had absorbed the whole of the learning available to him in his own land. And his hunger for knowledge was not satisfied. He wished to gather more, to learn from the great scholars of other lands, to seek out the traditions wherever they could be found. The boy from Bukhara, having exhausted what his own region could teach him, was ready to set out into the wider world in search of knowledge. This early period of his life established the foundations of all that would follow. The extraordinary memory, the early devotion to the traditions, the rapid mastery of the available knowledge, the hunger for more. The fatherless boy, raised by his devoted mother, had revealed himself as a prodigy of memory and learning, a young master of the traditions who surpassed even his elders. And now, his gifts established and his local learning exhausted, he was ready to begin the great work of his life, the journey across the Muslim world in search of the traditions, and the labor of sorting the authentic from the unreliable that would occupy the rest of his days. The great work of Imam Bukhari's life was, above all, a work of travel, of journeying across the vast expanse of the Muslim world in search of the traditions, and it is this aspect of his life that we must now consider, for it occupied the greater part of his days. For the traditions he sought were scattered across many lands, held in the memories of scholars in distant cities, and to gather them, to learn them from those who held them, required travel on an immense scale, sustained over many years. By the accounts, Bukhari spent some 40 years traveling in pursuit of the traditions, journeying across nearly the whole of the known Muslim world. He began, after exhausting the learning of his own region, with the journey to the holy cities of Arabia, to Mecca and Medina, the heartland of his faith, where many of the great scholars of the traditions were to be found. It is said that he traveled there with his mother and brother while still a young man, and that he remained in the holy cities for a time, studying with their scholars, gathering their traditions, and even, by the accounts, composing one of his early works in Medina, while still only about 18 years old. From Arabia, his travels took him across the wider Muslim world, to the great centers of learning in many lands. He journeyed to the cities of Iraq, to Basra and Kufa and Baghdad, great centers of scholarship where many masters of the traditions taught. He traveled to Egypt, to Syria, to the lands of Persia and Khorasan, to wherever the scholars of the traditions were to be found. Over the years he visited city after city, region after region, seeking out the scholars who held the traditions, learning from them, gathering their reports, adding to the vast store of knowledge he carried in his prodigious memory. It was a life of constant movement, of journeying from place to place across an immense expanse, sustained over decades in the single-minded pursuit of the traditions. We should try to imagine what such travel meant in that age, for it was nothing like the easy journeying of our own time. To travel across the Muslim world in the 9th century was to undertake long and arduous journeys, by foot and by animal, across deserts and mountains, facing the dangers and hardships of the road, the bandits and the weather and the difficulties of the way. Such journeys took weeks and months, were physically demanding and often dangerous, and required great determination and endurance. Bukhari undertook such journeys again and again, over 40 years, crossing and recrossing the vast expanse of the Muslim world, enduring all the hardships of travel in the pursuit of the traditions. It was a life of remarkable physical endurance as well as intellectual labor, sustained over decades in the single-minded pursuit of his great work. And the purpose of all this travel was to gather the traditions from those who held them, to learn the reports directly from the scholars who transmitted them. For in the science of the traditions, it mattered greatly to receive a tradition directly, through a reliable chain of transmission, from a trustworthy teacher. To gather the traditions reliably, Bukhari had to seek out the scholars who held them, to learn the reports directly from them, to establish the chains of transmission through which the traditions had come down. And so he traveled to the scholars wherever they were, gathering their traditions, establishing the chains, building the vast store of reliably transmitted reports from which he would later select for his great work. By the accounts, he studied with a vast number of teachers over the course of his travels, by some reports more than 1,000 scholars of the traditions. From each he gathered traditions, learned reports, established chains of transmission. He met and learned from the greatest masters of the traditions of his age, the foremost scholars in every land he visited, and he gathered, over the years of his travels, an enormous store of traditions, hundreds of thousands of reports by the accounts, each held in his prodigious memory with its chain of transmitters. The vast store of traditions that he gathered through his decades of travel was the raw material from which he would later select, with rigorous care, the traditions for his great work. Let us dwell more fully on the decades of travel that occupied the greater part of Imam Bukhari's life, for they were an extraordinary undertaking, and they reveal much about his devotion and his endurance. For some 40 years, by the accounts, he journeyed across the vast expanse of the Muslim world, crossing and recrossing immense distances in his single-minded pursuit of the traditions. His travels began, as we have noted, with the journey to the holy cities of Arabia, the heartland of his faith, where he went as a young man with his mother and brother. The journey from Bukhara to Arabia was itself immense, crossing vast distances of desert and mountain, taking weeks and months of arduous travel. And it was only the beginning, for from Arabia his travels would take him across nearly the whole of the known Muslim world, to the great centers of learning in many lands, in a pursuit of the traditions that would last for decades. He traveled to the lands of Iraq, to the great cities of Basra and Kufa and Baghdad, which were among the foremost centers of learning in the world. Baghdad in particular was the capital of the age, a vast and brilliant city, a center of scholarship and culture, home to many of the greatest scholars of the traditions. Bukhari visited these cities, studied with their scholars, gathered their traditions, adding to his vast store. He returned to some of them more than once over the years, deepening his knowledge, gathering more traditions, learning from the masters who taught there. He journeyed to Egypt, the ancient land along the great river, which had become an important center of the faith and its learning. He traveled to Syria, to the cities of the eastern Mediterranean, with their own traditions and scholars. He went to the lands of Persia, to the cities of Khorasan and the wider Persian world, including the great city of Nishapur, an important center of learning where he would spend significant time. And he traveled throughout the lands of Central Asia, his own homeland, gathering traditions wherever the scholars were to be found. Over the decades, his travels carried him across an immense expanse, from the heartland of Arabia to the distant lands of Central Asia, from Egypt in the west to Khorasan in the east. We should try to feel the magnitude of this travel, the endurance it required, the hardships it involved. To travel across these vast distances in the 9th century was to undertake long and arduous journeys, by foot and by riding animal and by caravan, across deserts and mountains and plains, facing the dangers of the road, the bandits and the harsh weather and the difficulties of the way. Such journeys were physically demanding, often dangerous, requiring great endurance and determination. And Bukhari undertook them again and again, over 40 years, crossing and recrossing the vast expanse of the Muslim world, enduring all the hardships of travel in his single-minded pursuit of the traditions. It was a feat of remarkable physical endurance as well as intellectual devotion, and the purpose of all this travel, as we have noted, was to gather the traditions directly from those who held them, to receive the reports through reliable chains from trustworthy teachers. This was essential to the rigor of his method, for to verify a tradition required receiving it through a sound chain, and to establish the chain required learning the tradition directly from a reliable transmitter. Bukhari could not gather the traditions reliably without traveling to the scholars who held them, learning the reports directly, establishing the chains of transmission. And so he traveled, for decades, to the scholars wherever they were, gathering the traditions directly, building the vast store of reliably transmitted reports from which he would select for his great work. By the accounts, he studied with an enormous number of teachers over his decades of travel, by some reports more than 1,000 scholars of the traditions. Imagine the scale of this, the number of teachers sought out, the traditions gathered from each, the chains established, the knowledge accumulated. From each teacher he gathered traditions, learned reports, established chains, added to his store. He met and learned from the greatest masters of the traditions of his age, in every land he visited, gathering from each what they had to offer. The vast store of traditions he accumulated, hundreds of thousands of reports by the accounts, was the fruit of this immense labor of travel and study, sustained over decades across the whole expanse of the Muslim world. A deeply moving quality fills this devotion, this willingness to give decades of one's life to travel and hardship in the pursuit of knowledge. Bukhari could have lived a comfortable and settled life. Instead, he chose decades of arduous travel, enduring great hardships, all for the sake of gathering the traditions accurately. His devotion to the accurate preservation of the traditions was so great that he gave the greater part of his life to this travel, this hardship, this single-minded pursuit. And the fruit of this devotion was the vast store of reliably gathered traditions from which he produced his great work, the collection that has been trusted for over 1,000 years. The decades of travel and hardship were the foundation of the achievement, the price he paid for the rigor and reliability of his great work. A deeply impressive quality marks this devotion to travel in the pursuit of knowledge, this willingness to spend decades journeying across a vast expanse, enduring all the hardships of the road, in order to gather the traditions from those who held them. It reflects the immense value that Bukhari placed on the traditions, on their accurate preservation, on receiving them reliably from trustworthy sources. He could have remained in his own city, content with the traditions available there. Instead, he gave decades of his life to travel, to seeking out the traditions wherever they were held, to gathering them directly from the scholars across the whole Muslim world. This devotion to travel in the pursuit of knowledge was central to his great work, and it reflects the depth of his commitment to the accurate preservation of the traditions. Consider the contrast between this and our own age, in which knowledge is so easily accessible, available at a touch, without travel or hardship. Bukhari had to travel for decades, across vast distances, enduring great hardships, to gather the knowledge he sought. We can access vast stores of knowledge instantly, without leaving our homes. And yet there is something in his devotion, his willingness to give decades of his life to the pursuit of knowledge, his readiness to endure great hardships for the sake of gathering the traditions accurately, that our easy access to knowledge cannot match. The very difficulty of his pursuit reflected and reinforced the value he placed on what he sought, the depth of his devotion to the accurate preservation of the precious traditions of his faith. Gathering the traditions was only the first part of Imam Bukhari's great work. The second, and in some ways the more important, was the verifying of them, the rigorous sorting of the authentic from the unreliable. And it is for this rigor, this exacting care for authenticity, that he is most celebrated. For Bukhari did not simply gather traditions and pass them on. He subjected them to the most careful scrutiny, accepting only those that met his rigorous standards, rejecting the vast majority as not sufficiently reliable. The science of verifying the traditions, as it had developed, focused above all on the chains of transmission, the lines of narrators through whom each tradition had been passed down from the prophet to the present. For a tradition to be reliable, this chain had to be sound. Each narrator in the chain had to be a trustworthy person, known for honesty and accuracy, and the chain had to be unbroken. each narrator having actually received the tradition from the one before. The verification of a tradition therefore required detailed knowledge of the narrators, of their characters and their reliability, of when and where they lived, and whom they could have met. And it was in this verification, this detailed scrutiny of the chains and the narrators, that Bukhari excelled above all others. To understand the heart of Imam Bukhari's work, we must understand more deeply the science of the chains of transmission, which lay at the center of the verification of the traditions. For this science, the careful tracing and evaluation of the lines of narrators through whom each tradition had come down, was the great tool by which the authentic was distinguished from the false, and it was in his mastery of this science that Bukhari excelled above all others. Each tradition, as it was transmitted, came with its chain, the list of those who had passed it down, from the one who had heard it from the Prophet, to that person's student, and so on down the generations to the one who recorded it. This chain was the credential of the tradition, the evidence of its transmission, the means by which its reliability could be judged. For if the chain was sound, if each narrator in it was trustworthy and had genuinely received the tradition from the one before, then the tradition could be trusted. But if the chain was flawed, if it contained an unreliable narrator, or a break where one narrator could not have received the tradition from the one named before, then the tradition was doubtful. The evaluation of these chains was therefore the central task of the verification of the traditions, and it required a vast and detailed knowledge. To judge a chain, one had to know the narrators, who they were, when and where they lived, whom they could have met, whether they were reliable, whether their memories were sound, whether they were honest. One had to know whether each narrator could genuinely have received the tradition from the one named before, whether they had lived at the same time, whether they could have met. This required a detailed knowledge of vast numbers of narrators, of their lives and characters and connections, a knowledge that took decades to gather and a prodigious memory to hold. Bukhari possessed this knowledge to an unmatched degree. Through his decades of travel and study, he had gathered detailed knowledge of vast numbers of narrators, of their lives and characters and reliability, of when and where they had lived, and whom they could have met. He held all this in his prodigious memory, ready to bring to bear on the evaluation of any chain. And he had developed a penetrating critical judgment, an ability to detect the subtle flaws that rendered a chain doubtful, the hidden defects that escaped less careful scholars. His mastery of the narrators and their connections, joined to his critical judgment, made him the greatest evaluator of the chains, able to verify the traditions with a rigor and an accuracy that surpassed all others. A particular rigor marks Bukhari's approach to the chains that deserves mention, for it was stricter than that of most other collectors. By the accounts, he required not merely that the narrators in a chain be reliable, and that it be possible for each to have received the tradition from the one before, but that it be established that they had actually met, that the transmission had genuinely occurred. This was a stricter standard than that of many other collectors, who might accept a chain if it was merely possible for the narrators to have met. Bukhari's stricter requirement, that the meeting be established, meant that he rejected traditions that others might have accepted, preserving only those whose chains were verified to the highest standard. This extra rigor was part of what made his collection so reliable, so trusted above others. We should appreciate the immense labor that this rigorous evaluation of the chains represented. To evaluate the chain of even a single tradition required detailed knowledge of each narrator in it, of their reliability and their connections. To do this for the hundreds of thousands of traditions that Bukhari gathered, to evaluate each chain, to judge each narrator, to verify each transmission, was a labor of immense magnitude, requiring vast knowledge and painstaking care. And Bukhari did this not carelessly, but with the greatest rigor, applying his exacting standards to each tradition, accepting only those whose chains met his strict criteria. The labor of this rigorous evaluation, sustained over a lifetime, was the heart of his great work. There is something deeply impressive in this science of the chains, this careful tracing of the lines of transmission, this rigorous evaluation of the reliability of each link. It represents a sophisticated method for evaluating the reliability of transmitted knowledge, for distinguishing the trustworthy from the doubtful, developed long before our own age, and its methods of evaluating sources. The scholars of the traditions had developed, in this science of the chains, a rigorous discipline for assessing the reliability of what was transmitted, and Bukhari was its greatest master, applying it with a rigor and an accuracy that have rarely been matched. It is a remarkable intellectual achievement, this science of evaluating transmitted knowledge, and Bukhari stands as its supreme practitioner. For Bukhari possessed not only a prodigious memory but an extraordinary critical faculty, a deep knowledge of the narrators and a penetrating judgment of their reliability. He had gathered, in his travels, detailed knowledge of vast numbers of narrators, of their characters and their lives, of their reliability and their connections. And he brought this knowledge to bear in the verification of the traditions, examining each chain, judging the reliability of each narrator, determining whether the chain was sound and unbroken. His command of the narrators and their reliability was unmatched, allowing him to detect flaws that others missed, to identify the subtle defects that rendered a tradition unreliable, to distinguish the truly authentic from the merely plausible. By the accounts, Bukhari set himself extraordinarily high standards for the traditions he would accept, stricter than those of almost any other collector. He required not only that the chain of narrators be sound and the narrators trustworthy, but, by the accounts, that it be established that each narrator had actually met the one before, had genuinely received the tradition directly, so that the chain was truly continuous. These rigorous standards meant that he rejected vast numbers of traditions that other, less strict collectors might have accepted, preserving only those that met his exacting criteria. Out of the hundreds of thousands of traditions he had gathered, he selected only a few thousand for his great work, rejecting the overwhelming majority as not meeting his rigorous standards of authenticity. There is a story that captures the depth of his concern for the character and reliability of the narrators, which we should tell gently as one of the traditions about him. It is said that Bukhari once traveled a great distance to learn traditions from a particular man, but that when he arrived and observed the man, he saw him deceiving an animal, pretending to offer it food in order to catch it, when there was no food. And Bukhari, by the accounts, judged that a man who would deceive even an animal could not be fully trusted to transmit the traditions with perfect honesty, and he declined to take traditions from him, abandoning the journey he had made. Whether or not the story is exact in every detail, it captures something real about Bukhari's rigor, his concern not only for the soundness of the chains, but for the character and honesty of those who transmitted the traditions. He would accept traditions only from those he judged truly trustworthy, and he scrutinized the character of the narrators with the greatest care. It was through this rigorous gathering and verifying, sustained over many years, that Bukhari produced his great work, the collection of authentic traditions for which he is celebrated. He worked on it, by the accounts, for some 16 years, selecting from the vast store he had gathered only those traditions that met his rigorous standards, arranging them by subject so that they could be used as a guide to the faith and its practice. The result was a collection of several thousand traditions, each one verified by his exacting criteria, arranged systematically, a work of immense labor and rigor representing the distillation of a lifetime of gathering and verifying. The 16 years that Imam Bukhari spent composing his great work deserve our particular attention, for they represent an extraordinary discipline of selection, a willingness to labor long and to reject much in the pursuit of a perfect result. For the great work was not merely gathered but selected, composed through a rigorous process of choosing, from the vast store he had accumulated, only those traditions that met his exacting standards. We should appreciate what this selection involved. Bukhari had gathered, over his decades of travel, hundreds of thousands of traditions, each held in his prodigious memory with its chain. From this vast store, he selected, for his great work, only a few thousand, the small fraction that met his rigorous criteria of authenticity. The overwhelming majority of the traditions he had gathered were not included, were set aside as not meeting his exacting standards. This was a discipline of rejection as much as selection, a willingness to set aside the vast majority of what he had gathered in order to preserve only the most reliable. A remarkable discipline marks this willingness to reject so much in the pursuit of quality. Bukhari had labored for decades to gather his vast store of traditions. It would have been easy and tempting to include more of them in his great work, to make it larger and more comprehensive. But he resisted this temptation, holding to his rigorous standards, including only the traditions that met his exacting criteria, rejecting the rest, however much labor they had cost him to gather. This discipline of rejection, this willingness to set aside the merely good in pursuit of the truly excellent, was central to the quality of his work, to its unmatched reliability. And the process of selection took years, 16 years by the accounts, for it was not a quick or careless winnowing, but a careful, deliberate, rigorous process. Each tradition considered for inclusion had to be evaluated against his exacting standards, its chain examined, its narrators judged, its reliability established to the highest degree. This careful evaluation, applied to the traditions considered for the great work, took years of patient labor, sustained over a long period. Bukhari did not rush the work, did not compromise his standards for the sake of speed, but labored patiently for 16 years, ensuring that each tradition included met his rigorous criteria. There are stories told of the care with which he composed the work, which we should hold gently as the traditions about him, but which capture the spirit of his labor. It is said that he would not include a tradition without careful deliberation, that he approached the work with the utmost seriousness and devotion, that he treated the composition as a sacred task to be performed with perfect care. It is said that he would perform acts of worship and seek guidance before including traditions, treating the work not merely as a scholarly task, but as a sacred trust. Whatever the precise truth of these stories, they reflect the spirit of his labor, the seriousness and devotion and care with which he approached the composition of his great work. Consider this discipline of selection, this willingness to reject much in the pursuit of quality, for it is a discipline our own age often lacks. We tend, in our age, toward accumulation, toward more, toward comprehensiveness, valuing quantity and inclusiveness. Bukhari valued the opposite, rigorous selection, the rejection of all but the best, the pursuit of quality through the willingness to exclude. His great work was great not because it included everything but because it included only the best, because it was rigorously selected, because so much was rejected in the pursuit of perfect reliability. There is a lesson in this, about the value of rigorous selection, of the discipline of rejection, of the pursuit of quality through the willingness to exclude all but the best. And there is a deeper lesson still, about the patient labor required for excellent work, the willingness to spend years in the careful pursuit of a perfect result. Bukhari spent 16 years on his great work, refusing to rush, refusing to compromise his standards, laboring patiently until the work met his exacting criteria. In our age of haste, of quick results, of the rush to produce and publish, this patient labor, this willingness to spend years in the careful pursuit of excellence, stands as a rebuke and an inspiration. The greatest work, Bukhari's example suggests, requires patience, the willingness to labor long, to refuse to rush, to spend whatever time is needed to achieve a result of true excellence. His 16 years of patient labor produced a work that has been trusted for over 1,000 years, standing as proof of the value of patient, careful, uncompromising labor in the pursuit of excellence. This great work came to be regarded, in his tradition, as the most authentic collection of the traditions ever produced, second in authority, among the books of his faith, only to the sacred scripture itself. Its authority rested on the rigor of Bukhari's method, the exacting standards by which he had selected its traditions, the care with which he had verified each one. Because he had been so strict, so careful, so rigorous, the traditions in his collection could be relied upon with the greatest confidence, and the work became the foundation upon which much of the faith's law and practice rested. The collection of the careful scholar from Bukhara became one of the most important books of his faith, revered and relied upon across the centuries. We should appreciate the magnitude of this achievement, the labor and the rigor it represented. To gather hundreds of thousands of traditions through decades of travel, to verify each one through detailed scrutiny of its chain and narrators, to select only the few thousand that met the most exacting standards, to arrange them systematically into a comprehensive work, all of this was a labor of immense magnitude, sustained over a lifetime, requiring extraordinary memory, knowledge, judgment, and devotion. Bukhari accomplished it through the combination of his prodigious gifts and his tireless devotion, his extraordinary memory and his rigorous method, his decades of travel, and his years of careful selection. And the result was a work that has been revered and relied upon for over 1,000 years, one of the great monuments of his faith's scholarship. For all his prodigious gifts and his immense achievements, Imam Bukhari was remembered by those who knew him, not only for his learning but for the quality of his character. And this too is part of his story, perhaps the most important part, for he was, by all accounts, a man of deep piety, of genuine humility, of remarkable integrity, whose character matched the greatness of his learning. There is a theme at the very center of Imam Bukhari's life and work that deserves our deepest reflection, for it speaks with particular force to our own age. The devotion to truth, the care for authenticity, the rigorous distinguishing of the genuine from the false. For this was the heart of his life's work, and it is a concern that our own age urgently shares. Bukhari devoted his entire life to a single great task, ensuring that what was passed on as the traditions of the Prophet was genuine and reliable, sorting the authentic from the false, preserving the true and rejecting the fabricated. This was, at its core, a devotion to truth, a refusal to let the false masquerade as the true, a determination to preserve only what was genuine. He cared, more than almost anyone, about authenticity, about getting things right, about ensuring that what was transmitted was reliable, and he gave his whole life to this care, this devotion to truth and authenticity. We live, in our own age, in a time when this devotion to truth and authenticity has become urgently needed, perhaps more than ever before. For we are awash, in our age, with information of every kind, flowing to us in vast quantities through many channels, much of it unreliable, misleading, or outright false. The genuine mingles with the fabricated, the reliable with the false, the true with the misleading, and the difficulty of distinguishing them has become one of the great challenges of our time. We struggle, as Bukhari's age struggled in the realm of the traditions, to sort the authentic from the false, to know what we can trust. Bukhari's example speaks directly to this challenge, offering a model of the rigorous devotion to truth that our age needs. He did not accept what he was told uncritically. He scrutinized it, evaluated its reliability, traced its sources, judged its trustworthiness. He did not pass on what he was not sure of. He held to rigorous standards, accepting only what met his exacting criteria. He cared more for truth than for quantity, more for reliability than for comprehensiveness, rejecting the doubtful however much it cost him. This rigorous devotion to truth, this careful scrutiny of reliability, this refusal to accept or pass on the doubtful, is exactly the discipline our own age needs in its handling of the flood of information that surrounds us. We might learn from his method, adapted to our own age and its challenges. Bukhari evaluated the reliability of the traditions by examining their sources, tracing their chains of transmission, judging the trustworthiness of those who pass them down. We too can evaluate the reliability of what we are told by examining its sources, considering their trustworthiness, tracing the chains by which information reaches us. Bukhari refused to accept or pass on what he was not sure of. We too can cultivate the discipline of not accepting or passing on what we have not verified, of withholding judgment until reliability is established, of refusing to spread the doubtful or the false. His rigorous method, adapted to our own age, offers a model for the responsible handling of information, the careful distinguishing of the reliable from the unreliable. And we might learn too from the value he placed on truth itself, the priority he gave to getting things right over other considerations. Bukhari cared more for truth than for quantity, more for accuracy than for speed, more for reliability than for convenience. He would rather include fewer traditions and be sure of them than include more and risk error. He would rather labor for years and get it right than rush and risk inaccuracy. This priority of truth, this valuing of accuracy above other considerations, is a discipline our own age often lacks, in its haste, its love of quantity, its preference for speed and convenience. Bukhari's example calls us to value truth more highly, to prioritize accuracy, to care more for getting things right than for getting them fast or getting more of them. A deeply admirable quality marks this lifelong devotion to truth, this giving of a whole life to the accurate preservation of what was genuine. Bukhari did not seek wealth or power or fame, though fame came to him. He sought truth, the accurate preservation of the precious traditions of his faith, the distinguishing of the genuine from the false. He gave his whole life to this, his prodigious gifts, his decades of travel, his years of rigorous labor, all devoted to the single great task of preserving truth. And there is a nobility in this devotion to truth, this giving of a life to accuracy and authenticity, that speaks across the centuries, calling us to a greater care for truth in our own lives and our own age. To contemplate this devotion to truth, as the night deepens, is itself a kind of clarification, a turning of the mind toward what is genuine and reliable, away from the flood of the doubtful and the false. There is a peace in the love of truth, in the care for what is genuine, in the rigorous distinguishing of the reliable from the unreliable. Bukhari found his life's meaning in this devotion to truth, and there is something steadying in contemplating it, a reminder of the value of truth, the importance of accuracy, the nobility of a life given to preserving what is genuine. In an age awash with the doubtful and the false, his devotion to truth shines as a quiet light, calling us to care for truth, to value accuracy, to distinguish the genuine from the false with something of his rigorous care. He was, by the accounts, deeply pious, devoted to the worship of God, careful in his religious observance, sincere in his faith. His vast learning did not make him proud, but seems rather to have deepened his humility, his sense of his own smallness before God and the vastness of what there was to know. He was generous, by the accounts, giving freely to the poor and to students, sharing what he had, careful with the wealth that came to him. He was honest and principled, refusing to compromise his integrity, careful in all his dealings. And he was, by the accounts, gentle and soft-spoken, respectful and compassionate, bearing no ill will even toward those who wronged him. The greatness of his character matched the greatness of his learning, and it was part of why he was so revered. One particular quality of his character that deserves mention, for it connects with his life's work: his scrupulous honesty, his absolute commitment to truth. The man who devoted his life to verifying the traditions, to distinguishing the authentic from the false, was himself a man of perfect honesty, who would not himself transmit anything he was not sure of, who held himself to the same rigorous standards of truthfulness that he applied to the traditions. His scholarly rigor was an expression of his personal integrity, his commitment to truth in his scholarship flowing from his commitment to truth in his character. The two were one, the honest scholar and the honest man, united in a single devotion to truth. The character of Imam Bukhari deserves a fuller consideration, for he was remembered not only for his learning, but for the quality of his soul, and his character was, in its way, as remarkable as his scholarship. Let us dwell on the qualities that those who knew him most admired. Foremost among these was his piety, his deep and sincere devotion to God. For all his learning, all his fame, all his prodigious gifts, Bukhari remained, at his core, a devout and humble servant of God, careful in his worship, sincere in his faith, devoted to the religious life. His scholarship was not separate from his piety but an expression of it, for the traditions he gathered and preserved were the precious knowledge of his faith, and his labor on them was a form of devotion, a service to his religion and his God. His piety and his scholarship were one, the devout man and the great scholar united in a single devotion to his faith and its precious knowledge. His humility was as remarkable as his piety, and the more striking given his prodigious gifts and his immense achievements. For Bukhari might have been proud, might have boasted of his extraordinary memory, his vast learning, his great work. Instead, he remained humble, modest about his gifts, careful not to display his learning for the sake of admiration. The stories of his childhood show this humility already present. The shy boy who answered modestly when asked how many traditions he had written, and it remained with him throughout his life, a genuine humility that his great achievements did not corrupt. His learning made him not proud but humble, more aware of the vastness of what there was to know, more conscious of his own smallness before God. His generosity was widely remembered, his open-handedness toward the poor and toward students. By the accounts, he gave freely of what he had, sharing his wealth with those in need, supporting students, careful not to hoard or to cling to worldly goods. He seems to have held the wealth that came to him lightly, using it generously for the benefit of others rather than for his own comfort or accumulation. This generosity flowed from his piety and his detachment from the world, his sense that worldly goods were to be used for good rather than hoarded for oneself. He was generous with his wealth as he was generous with his knowledge, open-handed toward those in need, sharing what he had been given. His integrity was perhaps the quality most closely connected with his life's work, for the man who devoted his life to truth was himself a man of perfect truthfulness. He held himself to the same rigorous standards of honesty that he applied to the traditions, refusing to say what he was not sure of, careful in all his statements, scrupulous in his truthfulness. His scholarly rigor was an expression of his personal integrity, his commitment to truth in his scholarship flowing from his commitment to truth in his character. He was honest in his dealings, principled in his conduct, refusing to compromise his integrity for the sake of advantage or convenience. The honest scholar and the honest man were one, united in a single devotion to truth, and he was remembered, too, for his gentleness, his lack of malice, his freedom from ill will. By the accounts, he bore no grudges, harbored no malice, held no ill will even toward those who wronged him. Even toward those who turned against him in the disputes of his final years, who contributed to his exile, he seems to have borne no bitterness, no desire for revenge, but to have accepted his hardships with patience and without rancor. This freedom from malice, this gentleness of spirit, this absence of bitterness even toward those who wronged him, reflects a soul at peace, free of the resentments and hatreds that trouble so many hearts. It was a mark of his piety and his character, this gentleness and freedom from ill will, and it was part of why he was so revered. We should appreciate how this greatness of character matched and completed the greatness of his learning. For learning without character can be a hollow thing, even a dangerous one, knowledge in the service of pride or ambition or self-seeking. But Bukhari's learning was joined to a character of genuine piety, humility, generosity, integrity, and gentleness, so that his great gifts were placed in the service of his faith and his fellow human beings rather than his own glory. The greatness of his character ennobled the greatness of his learning, ensured that his prodigious gifts were used well, in the service of truth and of others. And it is part of why he was so revered, not only for what he knew and accomplished, but for what he was, the quality of his soul matching the greatness of his mind. There is a lesson in this, about the importance of character alongside ability, of the quality of the soul alongside the gifts of the mind. We may admire ability, talent, achievement, and rightly so. But these are best when joined to character, to the qualities of the soul that ensure they are used well. Bukhari's prodigious gifts were joined to a character of genuine piety and humility and integrity, and this union of great ability with great character is part of what makes him so admirable, so worthy of the reverence in which he has been held. His example reminds us that character matters as much as ability, that the quality of the soul matters as much as the gifts of the mind, and that the greatest lives are those in which great ability is joined to great character. As his life drew toward its later years, Bukhari, having completed his great work and his decades of travel, devoted himself to teaching, sharing the traditions he had gathered and verified with the students who flocked to learn from him. His fame had spread across the Muslim world, and students came from far and wide to study with the great master of the traditions, to receive from him the precious knowledge he had spent his life gathering. He taught widely, passing on his traditions and his learning, shaping a generation of scholars who would carry his knowledge forward. Some of his students would themselves become great scholars of the traditions, continuing his work, preserving and transmitting what they had received from him. Let us consider the human relationships that surrounded Imam Bukhari's work, the teachers from whom he learned, and the students whom he taught, for the transmission of the traditions was, above all, a human enterprise, passed from person to person across the generations. And Bukhari was a link in this living chain. We have noted that Bukhari studied with an enormous number of teachers over his decades of travel, by some reports more than 1,000 scholars of the traditions. These teachers were the sources of his knowledge, the ones from whom he received the traditions, the links through whom the precious reports came to him. Some of them were among the greatest scholars of the traditions of his age, the foremost masters in their lands, and Bukhari sought them out, learned from them, gathered their traditions, honored them as the sources of his knowledge. His relationship with his teachers was one of deep respect, for in his tradition the teacher who transmitted knowledge was honored as the source of a precious gift. Worth appreciating is the sheer number and range of his teachers, the way he gathered knowledge from so many sources across so many lands. He did not learn from a single master, nor confine himself to a single tradition or region. He sought out teachers across the whole Muslim world, learning from the masters of every land, gathering traditions from many sources, building his knowledge from a vast range of teachers. This breadth of learning, this gathering from many sources, was part of what made his knowledge so comprehensive, his command of the traditions so complete. He had learned from the foremost scholars of every land, gathered the traditions held in every region, building a knowledge that encompassed the traditions of the whole Muslim world. And Bukhari was not only a student but, in time, a teacher, sharing the traditions he had gathered and verified with the students who flocked to learn from him. As his fame spread, students came from far and wide to study with the great master of the traditions, to receive from him the precious knowledge he had spent his life gathering. He taught widely, especially in his later years, passing on his traditions and his learning, his method and his rigor, to a generation of students who would carry his knowledge forward. He was, in this, a link in the living chain of transmission, receiving the traditions from his teachers and passing them on to his students, a vital link through whom the precious knowledge flowed from one generation to the next. Some of his students would themselves become great scholars of the traditions, continuing his work, preserving and transmitting what they had received from him. The most famous of these would himself produce a great collection of the traditions, second only to Bukhari's own in authority and reverence, carrying forward the work of his teacher, applying a similar rigor to the gathering and verifying of the traditions. Through such students, Bukhari's influence extended beyond his own work, shaping the development of the science of the traditions, training the scholars who would carry it forward. His teaching, like his great work, was part of his contribution to the preservation of the traditions, the passing on of his knowledge and his method to those who would continue the work. There is something deeply significant in this image of the living chain of transmission, the passing of knowledge from teacher to student across the generations, of which Bukhari was a part. For the traditions were preserved not in books alone but in this living chain, this human transmission from one person to the next, each generation receiving from the one before and passing on to the one after. Bukhari received the traditions through this living chain, from teachers who had received them from their teachers, back across the generations to the source, and he passed them on through the same living chain, to students who would pass them to their students, forward across the generations to come. He was a link in this great chain of transmission, receiving and passing on the precious knowledge, a vital part of the human enterprise of preserving the traditions across time. We might reflect on the beauty and the importance of this human transmission of knowledge, this passing of precious learning from teacher to student across the generations. It is a deeply human enterprise, depending on the relationships between teachers and students, on the trust and the respect between them, on the faithfulness with which each generation receives and passes on what it has been given. The knowledge is preserved through these human relationships, these living links, this faithful transmission from person to person across time. Bukhari was a part of this human enterprise, a link in the living chain, and his work depended on it, on the teachers from whom he learned and the students to whom he taught. There is something beautiful in this, in the human transmission of knowledge across the generations, in the living chain through which the precious learning is preserved and passed on. But the final period of his life was darkened by a painful episode, a dispute that led to his exile from his home in his last years. The details of this dispute touch on theological matters that were contested in his age, and we will not enter into them, for they are complex and have been debated for centuries, and they lie beyond the scope of our quiet story. What matters for understanding his life is the broad shape of what happened. That toward the end of his life, Bukhari became involved in a controversy, that some turned against him, whether through genuine disagreement or through jealousy of his fame, and that he found himself, in his final years, forced from the city where he had hoped to settle. One particular detail of this final period that reveals his integrity and his principles. It is said that after he had returned toward his homeland, the governor of the region asked him to come and give private lessons to the governor and his children, to teach them the traditions in their own home, rather than in the public gatherings where all could attend. And Bukhari, by the accounts, refused, holding that knowledge should not be made the private privilege of the powerful, that he would teach in the open, where all who wished could come and learn, rather than giving special private classes to the great. This refusal, principled as it was, angered the governor, and contributed to Bukhari's being forced into exile from his home, sent away to a village far from the city. We tell this gently, not to take sides in old disputes, but because it reveals his character, his refusal to make knowledge the privilege of the powerful, his insistence on his principles even at great personal cost. And so, in his final years, the great scholar found himself exiled from his home, sent to a small village near the city of Samarkand, far from the centers of learning where he had hoped to spend his last days. A poignancy lingers in the thought of the greatest scholar of the traditions of his age, who had given his whole life to the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, ending his days in exile, sent away from his home through controversy and the displeasure of the powerful. It was a sad end to a life of such devotion and achievement, a final hardship laid upon a man who had given everything to his faith and its knowledge. The painful final period of Imam Bukhari's life, his exile from his home, deserves a fuller and more thoughtful consideration, for it reveals both the hardships that even the greatest can face and the integrity that Bukhari maintained even at great personal cost. Let us consider it with care. After his decades of travel and his years of labor on his great work, Bukhari came, in his later years, toward his homeland, hoping perhaps to settle and to teach in the cities where he had begun. But his final years were troubled by controversy and conflict, leading ultimately to his exile from his home. The details of the controversy touch on theological matters that were contested in his age, disputes that have been argued for centuries, and we will not enter into them, for they are complex and lie beyond the scope of our quiet story. What we can consider is the broad shape of what happened, and what it reveals about Bukhari's character and his circumstances. It seems that, toward the end of his life, Bukhari became the object of controversy, that some turned against him, whether through genuine disagreement on contested questions or through jealousy of his great fame and standing. The accounts suggest that jealousy played a part, that some among the scholars of the places he visited resented his fame and sought to diminish him. Such jealousy is a sad and common thing, the resentment of the great by the less great, and it seems to have played its part in the troubles of Bukhari's final years. The greatest scholar of the traditions of his age found himself, in his last years, the object of controversy and resentment, his fame breeding jealousy, his greatness provoking opposition. One particular episode, which we have touched upon, reveals his integrity in the face of these troubles. It reveals Bukhari's integrity in the face of these troubles. It is said that after he had returned toward his homeland, the governor of the region asked him to come and give private lessons to the governor and his children, teaching them the traditions in their own home rather than in the public gatherings where all could attend. And Bukhari refused, holding that knowledge should not be made the private privilege of the powerful, that he would teach in the open where all who wished could come and learn, rather than giving special private classes to the great. This was a principled refusal, an insistence that knowledge belonged to all, not only to the powerful, that it should be taught openly rather than hoarded as a privilege of the great. This refusal, principled as it was, came at a great cost, for it angered the governor and contributed to Bukhari's being forced from his home. Here we see the cost of integrity, the price that Bukhari paid for his principles. He could have complied with the governor's request, could have given the private lessons, could have secured the favor of the powerful and a comfortable place in his homeland. Instead, he held to his principle, refused to make knowledge the privilege of the powerful, and paid the price of his refusal in exile from his home. His integrity cost him dearly, but he maintained it nonetheless, holding to his principle even at great personal cost. There is something deeply admirable in this maintaining of principle even at great cost, this refusal to compromise integrity for the sake of comfort or favor. It is easy to maintain our principles when they cost us nothing. It is another thing to maintain them when they cost us dearly, when integrity means hardship, when principle means exile. Bukhari maintained his integrity at great cost, refusing to compromise even when compromise would have secured his comfort, holding to his principle even when it meant exile from his home. His integrity was not a matter of convenience but of genuine conviction, maintained even when it cost him dearly, and there is a deep nobility in this costly integrity. And there is a poignancy in the result, the exile of the great scholar in his final years. After a life given wholly to the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, after decades of travel and years of labor, after producing the work that would be revered for over 1,000 years, Bukhari ended his days in exile, sent away from his home to a small village, far from the centers of learning where he had hoped to spend his last days. It was a sad end to a life of such devotion and achievement, a final hardship laid upon a man who had given everything to his faith. There is a poignancy in this, in the thought of the greatest scholar of the traditions of his age ending his days in exile, his fame breeding jealousy, his integrity costing him his home. And yet there is, perhaps, a kind of dignity in it as well, even a fittingness. For Bukhari had given his whole life to truth and principle, to the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge regardless of cost, to the maintaining of his standards regardless of consequence. And his exile, painful as it was the result of his maintaining his integrity to the end, his refusal to compromise his principles even when compromise would have secured his comfort. He ended his life as he had lived it, holding to truth and principle regardless of cost, maintaining his integrity even unto exile. There is a dignity in this consistency, this maintaining of principle to the very end, even when it brought hardship and exile. He was faithful to his principles to the last, and his exile was the price of that faithfulness, paid without compromise. It was in this village, in exile, that Imam Bukhari died, in the year 870, at about 60 years of age. We will not invent the scene of his passing, nor adorn it with marvels, for the simple truth is dignified enough. A man who had given his whole life to the preservation of the traditions of his faith, who had traveled the world and labored for decades to sort the authentic from the false, came at last to the end of his devoted life, far from his home, in a small village in the lands where he had been born. He was buried there, and his resting place became, and remains, a place that people visit and honor, in memory of the great scholar who had given his life to the preservation of truth. We mention this gently and with respect, as the simple fact of how he has been remembered, for our story is of his life, rather than of the honors paid after his death. But though his life ended in exile and hardship, his influence did not end, but spread and grew across the centuries, far beyond anything the sad circumstances of his death might suggest. For the great work he had produced, the collection of authentic traditions he had gathered and verified through a lifetime of labor, lived on, and grew in influence and authority across the generations. It came to be regarded as the most authentic collection of the traditions, second in authority among the books of his faith only to the sacred scripture itself. It became a foundation of the faith's law and practice, studied and relied upon by scholars and believers across the Muslim world, revered and cherished across the centuries. 1100 years after his death, the work of the careful scholar from Bukhara remains one of the most important and revered books of his faith, studied and honored wherever his faith is found. Though Imam Bukhari is most famous for his great collection of the authentic traditions, it was not his only work, and we should consider the broader range of his scholarship, as well as the remarkable endurance of his legacy across the centuries. For he was a prolific scholar, who produced a number of works, and whose influence has lasted for over 1,000 years. Among his other works was a great book of history, which gathered biographical information about the narrators of the traditions, the vast numbers of people through whom the reports had been transmitted. This was a work closely connected with his great task of verifying the traditions, for to judge the reliability of a tradition required knowledge of its narrators, and this biographical work gathered such knowledge, recording information about the narrators, their lives, and their reliability. It was a work of immense scholarship in its own right, a vast gathering of biographical information that served the science of the traditions, and it reflected the same devotion to detailed, accurate knowledge that marked his great collection. He wrote, too, other works on the traditions and related subjects, gathering reports on particular themes, addressing particular questions, contributing to the science of the traditions in various ways. He was a prolific scholar, whose output extended beyond his most famous work to a range of other writings, each reflecting his vast learning and his rigorous method. The full range of his scholarship was considerable, encompassing not only his great collection, but a number of other works that contributed to the science of the traditions and the preservation of his faith's knowledge. But it was his great collection, above all, that secured his lasting fame and influence, and the endurance of this work across the centuries is one of the most remarkable facts of his faith's history. From the time of its composition, the work was recognized as an achievement of unmatched rigor and reliability, and its authority grew across the generations until it came to be regarded as the most authentic collection of the traditions, second among the books of his faith only to the sacred scripture itself. For over 1,000 years, it has held this place of unmatched authority, revered and relied upon across the whole Muslim world. Consider what this endurance means, this holding of a place of unmatched authority for over 1,000 years. Most works, even great ones, are eventually superseded, their authority fading as new works appear, their place taken by later scholarship. But Bukhari's great collection has held its place for over 1,100 years, its authority undiminished, its reliability still trusted, its place among the most revered books of his faith still secure. This is an extraordinary endurance, a sign of the rigor and reliability of the work, the care with which Bukhari composed it, the exacting standards by which he selected its traditions. Because he was so rigorous, so careful, so exacting, his work has endured, trusted and revered across the centuries, holding its place of unmatched authority for over 1,000 years. The work has been studied, across these centuries, by countless scholars and students, memorized and commented upon and taught, made the foundation of the faith's law and practice, revered as a precious treasure. It has shaped the religious life of the Muslim world for over 1,000 years, providing the reliable traditions on which much of the faith's understanding and practice rests. Generation after generation has turned to it, trusted it, built upon it, revered it. The work of the careful scholar from Bukhara has become one of the most important and influential books in the history of his faith, its influence extending across the centuries and across the whole Muslim world. A deeply moving quality marks this endurance, this lasting influence flowing from a life of such devoted labor. Bukhari gave his whole life to the gathering and verifying of the traditions, his prodigious gifts, his decades of travel, his years of rigorous labor, all devoted to producing a reliable collection of his faith's precious knowledge. And the fruit of this devotion has endured for over 1,000 years, trusted and revered across the centuries, shaping the religious life of countless people across the generations. The devotion of his life has borne fruit beyond anything he could have imagined, his great work enduring and influencing across more than 11 centuries, a lasting monument to his lifelong devotion to the preservation of truth. And we who learn of his work, even now, are connected to him across this vast span of time, the recipients of the knowledge he labored to preserve, the heirs of his devotion to truth, the traditions he gathered and verified, the precious knowledge he labored to preserve, has reached across more than 1,000 years to us, surviving all the centuries between, a lasting inheritance preserved by his devoted labor. When we benefit from the traditions he preserved, when we draw on the knowledge he labored to gather and verify, we are connected to him across the gulf of time, the recipients of his lifelong devotion to the accurate preservation of his faith's precious knowledge. His devotion reaches across the centuries to benefit us still, his labor enduring to preserve for us the knowledge he gave his life to gather and verify. There is a lesson at the very center of Imam Bukhari's life that deserves our reflection, a lesson about the value of patient, sustained devotion to a single great task. For his life was, above all, a life of such devotion, given wholly to a single purpose, sustained over decades with unwavering dedication. Consider the singleness of his life's purpose. From his youth, Bukhari devoted himself to the traditions, to their gathering and verifying and preserving, and this devotion did not waver or scatter across his life. It remained constant, the single thread that ran through all his days. He did not divide his energies among many pursuits, did not move from interest to interest, did not scatter his devotion. He gave himself, wholly and constantly, to the single great task of preserving the traditions, sustaining this devotion across decades, through travel and hardship and labor, until the great work was complete. His was a life of singular devotion, focused on a single purpose, sustained with unwavering constancy. A great power lives in such singleness of purpose, such focused and sustained devotion to a single task. For the scattering of our energies across many pursuits, the moving from interest to interest, the division of our devotion, dissipates our power, prevents us from accomplishing anything great. But the focusing of our energies on a single purpose, the sustained devotion to a single task, concentrates our power, allows us to accomplish what scattered effort never could. Bukhari focused his prodigious energies on a single great task, sustained his devotion to it across decades, and thereby accomplished a work of unmatched magnitude and rigor. The singleness of his purpose, the focus of his devotion, was among the sources of his great achievement. And there is great power, too, in the patience of his labor, his willingness to sustain his devotion over decades, to labor long and patiently toward a distant goal. Bukhari did not seek quick results. He gave decades to his travels, years to the composition of his great work, sustaining his labor patiently over a long period. He understood, it seems, that great work requires patience, that the most valuable achievements are not produced quickly but built slowly, through sustained labor over time. And he had the patience for such labor, the willingness to sustain his devotion over decades, to labor long and patiently toward his goal. This patience, this capacity for sustained labor over time, was as essential to his achievement as his prodigious gifts. Consider how our own age, with its haste and its love of quick results, often lacks this patience, this capacity for sustained devotion to a single task over time. We tend, in our age, toward the quick and the immediate, toward fast results and rapid change, toward the scattering of our attention across many things. Bukhari's example stands as a rebuke and an inspiration, a reminder of the value of patient, sustained devotion to a single great task. The greatest achievements, his life suggests, require such patience, such sustained focus, such willingness to labor long toward a distant goal. His decades of patient devotion produced a work that has endured for over 1,000 years, and they testify to the power of sustained, focused, patient labor in the pursuit of a worthy goal. There is encouragement in this, too, for any of us who feel that our own efforts are too small, our own progress too slow, our own goals too distant. Bukhari's great work was not produced quickly, nor easily, but through decades of patient labor, sustained devotion, slow and steady progress toward a distant goal. He did not see the completion of his work for many years. He labored long before the fruit appeared, and his example encourages us to be patient in our own labors, to sustain our devotion over time, to continue toward our goals even when progress is slow and the goal is distant. The great achievements come not quickly but through sustained patient labor, and his example encourages us to such patient devotion in our own pursuits. And there is, finally, a lesson in the way his patient devotion was sustained by something larger than himself, by his devotion to his faith and its precious knowledge. Bukhari did not labor for his own glory or advantage, but for the preservation of his faith's precious traditions, for a purpose larger than himself. And this larger purpose sustained his devotion, gave him the motivation to labor long and patiently, to endure the hardships of his travels and the difficulties of his work. The devotion to a purpose larger than oneself, his life suggests, is what sustains the patient labor that great achievement requires. Bukhari's devotion to his faith and its precious knowledge sustained his decades of patient labor, and it reminds us that the sustained devotion great work requires is best founded on a purpose larger than ourselves, a goal worthy of a lifetime's devotion. And here we begin to see the deepest meaning of his life, the thing that makes it endure beyond all the particulars of his work and his achievements. His life was, above all, a life given to truth, to the painstaking labor of preserving precious knowledge with perfect accuracy, of sorting the authentic from the false, of ensuring that what was passed on was genuine and reliable. He devoted his whole life, his prodigious gifts, his decades of travel, his rigorous labor, to this single great task, the accurate preservation of the precious traditions of his faith. And he accomplished it with a rigor and a care that have rarely been matched, producing a work whose reliability has been trusted for over 1,000 years. There is a lesson in this that reaches across the centuries to each of us who hears it. It is the lesson of devotion to truth, of care for accuracy, of the painstaking labor of preserving what is precious with perfect care. In an age awash with information of uncertain reliability, where the false mingles so easily with the true, Bukhari's example calls us to a greater care for truth, a greater rigor in distinguishing the authentic from the false, a greater devotion to accuracy in what we accept and pass on. We need not match his prodigious gifts or his immense achievements, but we can learn from the spirit of his life, the spirit of devotion to truth, of care for accuracy, of the patient and rigorous labor of preserving what is genuine and rejecting what is false. Let us try for a moment to picture the texture of Imam Bukhari's life, the lived reality of his days, for behind the great achievements lay a person, living his life in devotion to his work and his faith. What was it like to be Imam Bukhari in the years of his travels and his labor? His days, we may imagine, were ordered around his devotion to the traditions and to his faith. There would have been the times of prayer and worship, the foundation of his devout life, structuring his days. There would have been his study, the constant gathering and reviewing and verifying of the traditions, the labor that occupied so much of his time. There would have been, in the years of his travels, the journeys themselves, the movement from place to place, the seeking out of teachers, the gathering of reports. And there would have been, woven through it all, the constant exercise of his prodigious memory, the holding and reviewing of the vast store of traditions he carried within him. His was a life of devotion and labor, ordered around his great task, filled with study and travel and worship. There are accounts of the intensity of his devotion to his work, which we should hold gently as the traditions about him, but which capture the spirit of his labor. It is said that he would rise in the night to record traditions that came to his mind, that his devotion to his work was so great that it filled even his sleeping hours, that he could not rest while there was work to be done. It is said that he approached his work with the utmost seriousness, treating it as a sacred trust, performing acts of worship in connection with it, seeking divine guidance in his labor. Whatever the precise truth of these accounts, they reflect the spirit of his devotion, the seriousness and intensity with which he pursued his great task. The way his work was for him not merely a scholarly pursuit but a sacred calling, and his life was, by the accounts, a simple and devout one, free of the love of luxury and worldly comfort, focused on his work and his faith. He held the wealth that came to him lightly, giving freely to others, careful not to be captured by the love of the world. He lived simply, focused on his devotion and his labor, free of the distractions and entanglements that worldly attachment brings. His simplicity served his devotion, freeing his energies for his great task, keeping his focus on his work and his faith rather than on the comforts and possessions of the world. There was a wholeness to his life, a focusing of all his energies on his single great purpose, a simplicity and devotion that served his work. We should picture him, then, as a man of singular devotion, ordering his days around his great task and his faith, laboring with intensity and seriousness, living simply and devoutly, his energies focused on the preservation of his faith's precious knowledge. It is a picture of a life given wholly to a worthy purpose, focused and devoted and simple, and it helps us to see the human reality behind the great achievements, the devoted life from which the great work flowed. As we draw toward the close of his story, let us reflect on the deepest meaning of his life, the devotion to truth that lay at its center, and on what it might mean for us. For Bukhari gave his whole life to truth, to the accurate preservation of what was genuine, to the rigorous distinguishing of the authentic from the false. And this devotion to truth is, perhaps, the deepest gift of his life to us, the example that speaks most powerfully across the centuries. We live in an age that often values other things above truth, that prizes speed and convenience and quantity, that accepts the doubtful and spreads the unverified, that struggles to distinguish the genuine from the false amid the flood of information that surrounds us. And in such an age, Bukhari's devotion to truth, his rigorous care for accuracy, his patient labor to distinguish the authentic from the false, speaks with particular force, calling us to a greater care for truth, a greater rigor in our handling of what we accept and pass on. His example reminds us of the value of truth, the importance of accuracy, the nobility of a life given to preserving what is genuine. It calls us to care more for truth in our own lives, to be more rigorous in distinguishing the reliable from the unreliable, to value accuracy above speed and convenience. To contemplate this devotion to truth, as the night deepens and your thoughts grow still, is itself a kind of peace, a turning of the mind toward what is genuine and reliable, away from the flood of the doubtful and the false. There is a quiet in the love of truth, a steadiness in the care for what is genuine, a peace in the contemplation of a life given wholly to accuracy and authenticity. So as you rest tonight, you might carry with you a little of Bukhari's spirit, his devotion to truth, his care for accuracy, his patient labor to preserve what is genuine. The man who spent 16 years collecting a single book, who traveled the world for decades in the pursuit of truth, who gave his whole life to the accurate preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, has finished his long and devoted journey. And his devotion to truth remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to care for truth, to value accuracy, to preserve what is genuine, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. Let us reflect more deeply on what it was that Imam Bukhari labored to preserve, for understanding this helps us to see the significance of his life's work. He labored to preserve the traditions of the Prophet, the record of what the founder of his faith had said and done, and this was, for his community, a treasure of the greatest value. For the believers of his faith, the Prophet was the great exemplar, the model of how their faith should be lived, the one whose teaching and example showed them the way. To know what the Prophet had said and done was therefore to know how to live their faith, how to worship, how to order their lives and their communities, how to embody the teachings of their religion. The traditions, the record of the Prophet's sayings and actions, were the means by which this precious knowledge was preserved and transmitted, the guide by which the believers could pattern their lives on the example of the one they revered. To preserve these traditions accurately was therefore to preserve the believers' access to the example they sought to follow, to ensure that they could know truly how the Prophet had lived and taught, rather than being misled by false reports. The accurate preservation of the traditions was, in this sense, the preservation of the faith's guidance itself, the safeguarding of the believers' access to the example they revered. And the danger of false traditions was correspondingly grave, for a false tradition, attributed to the Prophet but not genuinely his, could mislead the believers, could distort their understanding of their faith, could lead them astray from the true example they sought to follow. This is why Bukhari's work was of such importance, and why his rigor was so valued. By distinguishing the authentic traditions from the false, by preserving the genuine and rejecting the fabricated, he safeguarded the believer's access to the true example of the Prophet, protected the integrity of the faith's guidance, defended the community against the danger of being misled by false reports. His rigorous verification was not mere scholarly fastidiousness, but a service of the greatest religious importance, the safeguarding of the faith's most precious knowledge, the protection of the believer's access to the example they revered. We can understand, In this light, the seriousness with which Bukhari approached his work, the rigor he brought to it, the care he took to accept only the genuine, for he understood the importance of what he was doing, the gravity of the task, the consequences of error. To include a false tradition would be to risk misleading the believers, distorting their faith, attributing to the Prophet what he had not said. And so Bukhari was rigorous, careful, exacting, accepting only what he was sure of, rejecting the doubtful, ensuring that what he preserved was genuine. His rigor flowed from his understanding of the importance and the gravity of his task. The seriousness of preserving the faith's most precious knowledge accurately. A deeply admirable quality marks this sense of the gravity of his task, this understanding of the importance of accuracy in the preservation of precious knowledge. Bukhari did not treat his work lightly, did not approach it carelessly, but with the utmost seriousness, understanding the consequences of error, the importance of getting it right. He bore the weight of his responsibility, the gravity of preserving the faith's precious knowledge accurately, and he discharged it with a rigor and a care worthy of its importance. There is a nobility in this, in the serious discharge of a grave responsibility, the careful preservation of precious knowledge with a rigor worthy of its value. And we might reflect on the broader importance of preserving precious knowledge accurately, of the care that such preservation requires. For all precious knowledge, not only the religious traditions that Bukhari preserved, requires accurate preservation, careful transmission, rigorous protection against error and corruption. The knowledge that humanity has gathered, the wisdom it has accumulated, the precious learning of the past, all of it requires faithful preservation if it is not to be lost or corrupted. Bukhari's example, his rigorous care for the accurate preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, points to the broader importance of such faithful preservation, the care required to protect precious knowledge against loss and corruption, to transmit it faithfully to the generations that come after. There is a particular aspect of Imam Bukhari's life that bears further reflection, the way his life was, above all, a life of seeking, a journey in pursuit of knowledge that occupied his days from youth to age. For seeking was the very pattern of his life, the journey in pursuit of the traditions that defined his existence. From his youth, when he first set out from his homeland in pursuit of the traditions, to his decades of travel across the Muslim world, Bukhari's life was a life of seeking, of journeying in pursuit of knowledge. He was, throughout his life, a seeker, one who went out in search of what he valued, who journeyed in pursuit of the traditions, who gave his days to the seeking of knowledge. The journey was not merely a means to his work but the very pattern of his life, the seeking that defined his existence, the pursuit that occupied his days. A deep significance marks this pattern of seeking, this life given to the pursuit of knowledge. For the seeker is one who knows that what they value is not simply at hand, but must be sought, pursued, traveled toward, one who is willing to go out in search of what they value, to journey in its pursuit, to give their days to the seeking. Bukhari was such a seeker, one who knew that the traditions he valued must be sought across the wide world, gathered from the scholars who held them, pursued through decades of travel. And he embraced this seeking, gave his life to it, made the journey in pursuit of knowledge the very pattern of his existence. Consider the spirit of the seeker, this willingness to go out in pursuit of what we value, to journey toward it, to give our days to the seeking. It is a noble spirit, this seeking, this refusal to remain content with what is merely at hand, this willingness to journey in pursuit of what we value. The seeker does not wait passively for knowledge to come, but goes out in its pursuit, travels toward it, seeks it where it is to be found. And there is something admirable in this active seeking, this journeying in pursuit of what we value, this giving of our days to the search. Bukhari embodied this spirit of seeking to a remarkable degree, giving his life to the pursuit of the traditions, journeying across the world in their search. And there is, in the spirit of seeking, a kind of humility, an acknowledgement that we do not already possess what we seek, that we must go out and find it, that it lies beyond us and must be pursued. The seeker does not imagine that they already have all they need, but acknowledges their need, their lack, and goes out in pursuit of what they lack. Bukhari, for all his prodigious gifts and his vast learning, remained a seeker throughout his life, always pursuing more knowledge, always journeying after more traditions, never imagining that he had gathered all there was to gather. This humility of the seeker, this acknowledgement of one's continuing need, this perpetual pursuit of more, was part of his greatness, the spirit that kept him seeking throughout his life. There is encouragement in this for all of us who seek, in our own ways, the things we value, who journey in pursuit of knowledge or understanding or growth. Bukhari's life shows the nobility of seeking, the value of the active pursuit of what we value, the willingness to journey toward our goals rather than waiting passively for them to come. It encourages us to be seekers, to go out in pursuit of what we value, to journey toward our goals, to give our days to the search. And it reminds us that the seeking itself, the pursuit of what we value, can be a noble pattern for a life, a worthy way to spend our days, as it was for Bukhari, whose life of seeking produced one of the great achievements of his faith. So we might see Bukhari's life in the end as a great journey, a lifelong seeking, a pursuit of the precious traditions that took him across the world and occupied his days from youth to age. He was a seeker, a traveler in pursuit of knowledge, one who gave his life to the search for what he valued most. And the fruit of this lifelong seeking was the great work he produced, the precious knowledge he gathered and preserved, the lasting legacy of his journey. His life of seeking bore fruit beyond anything he could have imagined, his pursuit of the traditions producing a work that has endured for over 1,000 years. The seeker found what he sought, and more, and left it as a gift for all the generations that would come after. Let us consider, before we close, the wider community of scholars within which Imam Bukhari worked, for he did not labor alone but as part of a great collective enterprise, the vast effort of his civilization to preserve the precious traditions of its faith. Understanding this helps us to see his achievement in its proper context, as the supreme accomplishment of a great collective endeavor. For the preservation of the traditions was not the work of one person but of many, a great collective enterprise sustained across generations. Many scholars, across many lands and many generations, devoted themselves to the gathering and verifying and preserving of the traditions, each contributing to the great task, each building on the work of those before. The science of the traditions, with its sophisticated methods, had developed through the collective labor of generations of scholars, each adding to the methods and the knowledge, refining the techniques of verification, gathering and preserving the traditions. Bukhari worked within this great collective enterprise, building on the work of those before him, drawing on the methods they had developed, the knowledge they had gathered. And in Bukhari's own age, there were other great scholars of the traditions, his contemporaries and his peers, who shared in the great task. Some were his teachers, from whom he learned. Some were his students whom he taught. Some were his fellow scholars, with whom he shared the work. The greatest of his students would himself produce a collection of the traditions, second only to Bukhari's own in authority and reverence. Other scholars of the age produced their own collections, applying their own rigor to the gathering and verifying of the traditions, contributing to the great task of preservation. Bukhari was the greatest of these, but he was not alone. He worked within a community of scholars all devoted to the preservation of the traditions, all contributing to the great collective enterprise. There is something to be appreciated in this collective character of the great work, this sharing of the task among many scholars across the generations. For the preservation of the traditions was too great a task for any one person, however gifted. It required the collective labor of many, sustained across generations, each contributing their part. Bukhari's great achievement was the supreme accomplishment within this collective enterprise. But it depended on the collective enterprise, built on the work of those before, shared with the scholars of his age, carried forward by those after. The great work of preservation was a collective achievement, and Bukhari's supreme accomplishment was its crowning glory, the highest point of a great collective endeavor sustained across generations. We might appreciate, in this, the way that great achievements often depend on great collective enterprises, the labor of many sustained across time. We tend to celebrate individual genius, the great achievements of remarkable individuals, and rightly so. But these individual achievements often depend on collective enterprises, on the work of many that makes the individual achievement possible. Bukhari's supreme accomplishment depended on the collective enterprise of the preservation of the traditions, the methods developed by generations of scholars, the knowledge gathered by many, the community of scholars within which he worked. His individual genius was real, but it flowered within a collective enterprise, built on the labor of many, and his achievement was the crowning glory of that collective endeavor. And there is encouragement in this too, for those of us who labor within collective enterprises, contributing our part to tasks greater than ourselves. For we need not accomplish everything alone, need not be the supreme genius. We can contribute our part to the great collective enterprises of which we are a part, building on the work of others, sharing the task with our fellows, carrying the work forward for those who come after. Bukhari's achievement was supreme, but it was a contribution to a collective enterprise, and most of us will contribute, more modestly, to the collective enterprises of which we are part. There is value in such contribution, such sharing in tasks greater than ourselves, such building on the work of others, and carrying it forward. The great collective enterprises of humanity, the preservation of knowledge, the advancement of understanding, the building of civilization, depend on such contributions, the labor of many sustained across generations, each adding their part to the great collective work. Let us pause, before we let his story rest, to hold in our minds the central image of his life, the image that gathers up its meaning. A lone traveler crossing the vast expanse of the Muslim world, journeying for decades from city to city, seeking out the scholars who held the precious traditions, gathering them with painstaking care, holding them in his prodigious memory, sorting the genuine from the false with a rigor that has rarely been matched. There is, in this image, something that speaks to the deepest part of us, the recognition of a life given wholly to truth, to the patient and devoted preservation of what is precious. For we are all, in our way, concerned with truth, with knowing what is genuine and what is false, with preserving what is precious and reliable. And in Imam Bukhari we see this concern raised to its highest pitch, a life given wholly to the pursuit and preservation of truth, to the rigorous distinguishing of the authentic from the false, to the careful preservation of precious knowledge. He shows us what devotion to truth can be, the lengths to which it can go, the rigor it can demand, the patience it can sustain. And he shows us the fruit of such devotion, the lasting value of a life given to truth, the work that endures across the centuries, because it was made with such rigorous care. He shows us, too, that such devotion to truth is worth the cost it demands, the decades of travel, the years of labor, the hardships endured, even the exile suffered. Bukhari paid a great cost for his devotion to truth, his life of travel and labor, his final exile. But the fruit of his devotion has endured for over 1,000 years, benefiting countless people, preserving the precious knowledge of his faith. His example shows that the devotion to truth, costly as it may be, bears fruit beyond the cost, produces work that endures, leaves a legacy that lasts. The cost is real, but the fruit is greater, and the devotion to truth is worth the price it demands. So as the night deepens and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of his spirit, his devotion to truth, his care for accuracy, his patient labor to preserve what is genuine. not as a burden, but as a quiet inspiration, a reminder of the value of truth, the nobility of a life given to its preservation. The man who spent 16 years collecting a single book, who traveled the world for decades in the pursuit of truth, who gave his whole life to the accurate preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, has finished his long and devoted journey. And his devotion to truth remains, across the centuries, a quiet light, calling us to care for truth, to value accuracy, to preserve what is genuine, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. And here we return, at the last, to the quiet question his life poses to each of us who hears it. He devoted his whole life to truth, to the painstaking preservation of what was genuine, to the rigorous rejection of what was false. His life asks us, gently, about our own relationship to truth, about the care we bring to distinguishing the authentic from the false, about our devotion to accuracy in what we believe and accept and pass on. In an age that often values speed over accuracy, the convenient over the true, his life poses a searching question about our own commitment to truth, our own care for getting things right. It is a question worth carrying, gently, into the quiet of the night. There is no need to answer that question tonight. Some questions are not meant to be solved quickly, but to be carried gently, turned over slowly, lived with over a long while. Let it rest beside you now softly, asking nothing of you but a moment's quiet reflection. The man who spent 16 years collecting a single book, who traveled the world for decades in the pursuit of truth, who gave his whole life to the accurate preservation of his faith's precious knowledge, has finished his own long and devoted journey, and you have followed it, gently, all the way to its peaceful end. So let your thoughts grow still. Let the city of Bukhara fade into the dark, with its trade routes and its scholars, and the long roads across the Muslim world that he traveled for decades, and the careful scholar bent over his traditions, sorting the true from the false. Let the names and the dates drift away, for they have done their work. What remains is only the quiet, and the question, and the calm of the gathering night. May your mind grow easy, may your heart be untroubled, and may your rest tonight be deep and peaceful and kind.